Alright, welcome back, Sebastian here. So today I'm going to be doing my power rankings for the 2025 Singapore Grand Prix. So, starting out with number 20, a driver who had a pretty poor weekend, had I think in terms of his Red Bull stint, had a very strong weekend last time out at Baku. And so there was, I think, glimmers of hope that, maybe that form would continue into Singapore. And unfortunately, it did not. And, kind of back to reality with a pretty hard thump. Qualified 13th, and of course, if you don't know who I'm talking about, it's certainly Yuki Tsunoda. But qualified 13th, out-qualified by his teammate Verstappen by 7.8 tenths of a second. That's, I think, too big to be acceptable. And then in the Grand Prix, had a bit of a poor start, able to make up some positions, but ends up 12th. His teammate's on the podium, and he ends up being lapped by his teammate as well. So overall, pretty poor weekend for Tsunoda, and I felt, just given how far off, his teammate he was, it was just an overall very unacceptable from the Japanese driver. So, number 19, I'm going to move to Esteban Ocon. So for Ocon, a bit of a shocking, string of weekends, last couple races, and that unfortunately continued here for the Frenchman. Qualified 17th, out-qualified by his teammate. Rookie teammate, I must say, first time at Singapore by a whopping total of 5.7 tenths of a second. Just way too big to be acceptable. He's been on the radio in qualifying the last couple weekends complaining about brake issues, but when you're complaining about brake issues 75% of your qualifying sessions, I think the issue is more on you and not on your teammate. The issue is more on you and not on your car. Now, of course, because this is Singapore, couldn't really recover from that qualifying position, ends up coming home in 18th place. All right, number 18, I guess I probably could have put this driver behind Ocon, but the one bright spot for Hulkenberg's weekend is that he did qualify 11th, which ties his season best in qualifying. Out-qualified his teammate Bortoleto by 75 hundredths of a second. I think Bortoleto was unable to set up his final flying lap in qualifying because of Gasly. Basically, his car kind of broke down at the end of qualifying. But again, that was something that could have easily have affected Hulkenberg as well. So again, there's kind of a 50-50 on that one. But for Hulkenberg, he did make the biggest single mistake of the Grand Prix, a bit of a spin at turn 5, battling with Colapinto, and that drops him much further down than he otherwise would be. All right, number 17 is Liam Lawson. So for Lawson, qualifying continues to be a bit of a struggle. I think had a crash, pretty fair-sized crash in FP3, but I'm not really holding that against him here. In qualifying, qualified 12th, qualified by his teammate Hajar by about 3 tenths of a second. This was a car that was definitely good enough to be in the points. And a driver who was, right up to that first pit stop, Carlos Sainz was right behind Lawson. And so for the fact that Sainz got in the points, Lawson didn't show that there was definitely a bit of a performance difference there between the two drivers. And that's something that we kind of saw last time out in Baku as well, despite the fact that the cars were about, relatively evenly matched and they were starting very, very close on track together. That obviously, Sainz, much more experience, makes sense that his race pace would be far stronger than Lawson's. But I concur. So number 16 is, so that's 17, Lawson. Number 16 is Lance Stroll. So for Stroll, pretty unremarkable weekend, pretty normal in terms of qualifying gap for the season at least. Started the race in 13th, I think actually started the race in 15th. Qualified 17th, of course, both Williams got kicked out, so there's a bit of a discrepancy between what I say the qualifying is and what the actual qualifying was. Out-qualified by Alonso by about 2 tenths of a second, which again is not terrible, but Lance has not out-qualified Alonso even once this season. It's a streak that's got 18 weekends and counting, and we'll see if he indeed gets whitewashed. He'll be the first driver to be whitewashed in a 24 race season, so I guess Lance going for history this season. All right, now for the race, finished 13th, didn't really have a particularly terrible race, but didn't have a great race either. So I think 16th is a pretty fair spot for him. All right, now moving on to number 15, and I'm going with Pierre Gasly. So for Gasly, qualified, I think it was dead last in 20th. I know had that issue, but again, he did have 2 qualifying laps before then, just like his teammate, before that issue on the final run. But ended up starting from the pit lane, I guess, changing the setup. Yeah, and out-qualified by his teammate by 2.7 tenths of a second, so a little bit of a bigger gap than you would really want. And Colapinto's actually out-qualified Gasly for the last 5 races, so I do think that should put some set some alarm bells off for Gasly. The fact that he's being out-qualified, but in this kind of recent run of races, I mean, obviously the race pace, race performance, I think is still Gasly clearly has the edge there. But again, given Colapinto's relative inexperience compared to Gasly, is to be expected. But that being said, for Gasly, not a ton of pace this weekend, and a pretty lonely race to 19th place. All right, number 14 is Gabriel Bortoleto. So for Bortoleto, qualified 14th, out-qualified by his teammate Hulkenberg, like I said. But I felt like, again, for Bortoleto, I think caught out by Gasly's issues in qualifying, so that I think probably contributed to him getting knocked out. Race was relatively clean, finished in 17th, beat his teammate, but still overall not a great weekend, I would say, for either of the two Sauber drivers. All right, number 13, this is the first of the two Williams drivers. So for Albon, a bit of a tricky weekend. I think the race results look a little bit worse than it actually was, simply because, obviously his teammate scores points, he doesn't, so again, doesn't look great from his side. But for Albon, he did out-qualify Sainz before they were both thrown out of qualifying, out-qualified Sainz by 0.03 of a second, so very close gap there. They opted to start Albon from the pit lane, but Sainz from P18, and again, a couple positions difference there, so maybe that, influences the end result a bit. But for Albon, he did have a little bit of a comeback, a little bit of a fight back, finishes 14th on the road. I think shows that the Williams had some pretty decent pace in race pace, and it was kind of unfortunate that they got knocked out, basically got kicked out of qualifying. All right, number 12 is Franco Colapinto. So for Colapinto, not a great weekend on paper. I think, starting 16th and then finishing the race in 16th doesn't look great, but he did out-qualify Gasly, and he did beat Gasly in the race. And so I think, it shows, pretty solid progress from Colapinto. And I think a lot of that progress is being masked with kind of the wider audience, simply because the Alpine's performing so poorly. And they just look at the points and they see, Gasly is 20 and Doohan and Colapinto both have 0. So, you look at those numbers by themselves and you say, Colapinto's been terrible, he's trash, or whatever. Whereas reality, I think, is a lot more nuanced and complicated than that. And I think, I think Colapinto had a really tough start, first 5 to 7 races. I think he's come on leaps and bounds last, month and a bit or so. So I think, he's doing everything I think he needs to do to secure a seat. Maybe, a little bit less crashing here and there would be a little bit nice bonus. But I do think he's on track to retain a seat for 2026. All right, number 11 is Kimi Antonelli. So for Antonelli, I think 11th is a bit of a harsh rating. From given he did qualify 4th and he did race 4th, race to a 4th place finish, but he was out-qualified by his teammate George Russell by about 3.8 tenths of a second, and then of course beaten in the Grand Prix as his teammate went on to win the Grand Prix. Not necessarily in comfortable fashion, because I think if you put the order of the cars around, I think whoever ends up starting that Grand Prix in first probably wins the Grand Prix. So this was a race that was really determined by qualifying positions, and basically who kind of shuffled out where in the pecking order, after that first lap. So, but, I don't think it was a terrible Grand Prix, but I did feel like there were 11-10 drivers who I felt had slightly better Grand Prix weekends than Antonelli. So a little bit of a harsh rating, but I do think there were drivers who had better weekends overall. Okay, so now into the top 10, and number 10 is Oscar Piastri. So for Piastri, qualified 3rd, actually, no, that's not. Okay, so I've made a mistake here somewhere. So Antonelli finished 5th, not 4th. I did not have 2 drivers finishing 5th. I'm just going to make a note of that, just in case I ever have to check these notes again. But yeah, finishes 5th for Antonelli, and now moving on to the 4th place finisher, which is, of course, Piastri. Piastri, obviously, I think qualifying, could McLaren have finished qualified on pole? I think that's a tough one. I think, honestly, I think it would have been very, very tough for either Piastri or Norris to qualify on pole. But to be honest, this season we have not had a ton of races where it feels like either of them have just taken a complete lap out of the bag and taken a pole position that they shouldn't have. Obviously, that's harder said than done when you're, the fastest team and you're supposed to take pole most weekends. But it does feel like I think the McLaren car this year is a trickier car in qualifying, which might be part of the reason why that's the case. But still, I think, Piastri had a reasonably okay qualifying, especially kind of recovering from the fact that he was a little bit slower through the free practice sessions. In the Grand Prix, of course, however, bit of a tough start, didn't have the best of starts. Norris gets past him, and then in the Grand Prix just does not quite have Norris's pace. So I think it's a little bit harsh to put him 10th, a bit like what I said with Antonelli, but I did feel like it was overall a pretty so-so weekend, and this was a weekend where I feel like McLaren probably should have gotten both cars on the podium, and they didn't. So yeah, a little bit of an underperformance, I would say, from at least from Piastri's side. All right, so number 9 is Isaac Hadjar. So for Hadjar, qualified 8th, a really good qualifying performance. I think best of the rest. He even thought he could have done a little bit better, and perhaps he could have pipped off one of the Ferraris, but out-qualified, lost him by 0.3 of a second. So pretty good job there. In the Grand Prix, finishes 11th. Without an engine issue, probably gets points. And again, engine issue not his fault, so I think a little bit unfortunate for him. So I think 9th place is a good spot, and honestly, you can probably justify putting him maybe 3 to 4 positions higher than this. But I felt 9th was a reasonable spot for Hadjar. All right, now moving on to number 8, and 8th I'm putting Charles Leclerc. So for Leclerc, qualified 7th, so not a great qualifying session from Leclerc. Out-qualified by his teammate Hamilton by about 1/10 of a second. So again, not a great qualifying performance. The race performance I thought was pretty decent. Had a good start. Gets past Antonelli. Then of course the Ferrari was basically self-destructing, brakes not working, and that obviously made life a lot more difficult. And again, eventually lost a position to both Antonelli and then his teammate Hamilton, and then Hamilton's car went even more berserk and fell down the order. And so Leclerc kind of inherited that 6th place that probably should have been a 7th, but still I think there were some positives there from Leclerc. I thought his race was decent. Again, staying ahead of Antonelli for as long as he did was, I thought, a pretty good result as well. Okay, so number 7 is Lando Norris. So for Norris, this was again a bit of a tricky weekend. Does chip a little bit away at his teammates' championship lead. So again, that's a bit of a positive. But there's only 6 weekends to go, and with the points deficit he's at, he basically needs more than 3. He basically needs 3.5 to 4 points to basically beat his teammate by the end of the season. So again, we'll see how this goes. In the race, I think Norris had a really nice aggressive start, which was a really nice positive change to see. But it would be nice to see Norris have those aggressive starts when he's starting P2, P3, when having a really good aggressive start is the difference between a 2nd or a 3rd or a win. Here, it got him from 5th to 3rd. So that's, 5-point improvement. But again, if you're starting 3rd and you can potentially get 1st, that's a 10-point improvement. So maybe because, there's a little bit less risk involved, perhaps that's why he was able to be more aggressive. I don't know. But again, I think the race pace overall was very, very strong for Norris. If this was a track where you could overtake, he probably wins this Grand Prix, which again, I think says that he probably underperformed quite a bit in qualifying. Again, probably should not have started 5th, probably should have started on the front row, I think is my honest opinion. But nonetheless, not a terrible weekend, and I think it's slightly better of the 2 McLaren drivers was Norris. Okay, so moving into the top row, and number 6, I'm going with Carlos Sainz. So for Sainz, excellent recovery drive from P18 to P10. The only reason he's not higher is the fact that, again, he was out-qualified by his teammate Albon, so again, shows that there was a little bit of a deficiency there in terms of one-lap pace. Strategy, I think, was honestly not that beneficial. It wasn't in a race where, there's some races where sometimes drivers will luck into a result simply because, a team will split strategies. They're not sure which one's going to be the better strategy. And so sometimes driver will just get a good result just because they were on the much better strategy. But for example, if you look at Lawson, who starts right ahead of Sainz, or was right ahead of Sainz when he pitted, he ended up finishing 15th, so finished 5 positions behind him on the identical strategy. So it shows that this wasn't like some strategy that was just magically worked. Sainz really had to work for it. Did an excellent job, excellent race pace, and great execution, which is something that had been a big struggle earlier this season. But last time in Baku and this time in Singapore shows, I think it's starting to come together a bit more for Sainz, showing why Williams rated him so highly and signed him when they could. All right, so now moving on to number 5. And number 5, I'm going to go with Lewis Hamilton. So for Hamilton, a bit of an unfortunate weekend. It ends up finishing 8th. But again, I think got close to the most out of the Ferrari, qualifying 6th, out qualified Leclerc. In the race, a bit of a slow start, got beaten, passed by his teammate, of course. And then pretty strong pace towards the end. They were obviously Ferrari switched the 2 cars around. And perhaps if Hamilton had not overtaken Antonelli, they would have just swapped the positions back because again, again with the team orders and everything. But unfortunately, his race was really just compromised by the fact that his brakes basically failed. And again, he did kind of drive in a bit of a dangerous way on that final lap. And I kind of gave my thoughts on this in the review, but I don't think it was necessarily a Hamilton issue. I think it was more, if this FIA should be looking at this, and if they, they should be able to deem if this car is, in a dangerous condition, they should meat ball flag it, which of course would force them to bring the car in within, I think, 3 laps. And again, fix the issue, which in this case would probably be a retirement, but they didn't here. So again, I think the onus is more on the FIA to police this kind of stuff and less on Hamilton for any kind of, poor driving on his part. All right, number 4 is Oliver Behrman. So for Behrman, really, really solid overall weekend. Qualified P9, out-qualified his teammate Ocon by 5.7 tenths. And then in the race, really solid result, comes home for a P9 finish. I saw someone saying that he had a very uninspired, his driving was uninspired when he was behind Sainz. But I think the reality is just that's the way Singapore is with how difficult overtaking is, and you need like a 1.5 seconds delta. And so again, I'm not really holding that against him. I think the fact that he executed a really, really clean weekend, 9th for Haas is close to, perfect for them. And so I think, great job done by Behrman overall. Now, number 3 is the driver who led the midfield, and that is Fernando Alonso, who, if I was doing a power ranking based on race radio, he might have been number 1. If I did it that way. But no, this is based on driver performance, not on who had the best radios. So for Alonso, qualified 10th, which I think compared to their race pace on Friday was, I think, a bit of a disappointment. That they, Saturday was just so much worse than Friday, where they looked like they could have been genuinely like 3rd best team. So 10th again is probably close to what the most that they could have done, and then really good race pace, and then really good starts, and then some really nice overtakes as well by Alonso, despite the fact that he did a 10-second pit stop. So great job by the old man. Shows he still has it. All right, now moving on to your top 2, 1 and 2. So number 2 is Max Verstappen. That of course means that number 1 is George Russell. So first, Verstappen qualified 2nd, finished the race in 2nd, obliterates his teammate Tsunoda. Maybe could have gone pole with a perfect lap. I think that in terms of qualifying pace, I think the Mercedes and the Red Bull were very, very close in terms of performance. Maybe the Mercedes was like, I don't know, 200 faster, something tiny, ridiculous margin like that. But still, it would have required an almost perfect lap from Verstappen to get pole. Not able to do it. Of course, he was not happy with Norris for potentially not necessarily impeding him, but the dirty air basically made it so that pole was impossible. And on this track, you really need pole to have any real chance of winning. But still, I think Verstappen did, a great job given the circumstances. But I did think for Russell, driver who I've been first, those 2 qualifying laps on Saturday were absolutely superb. Basically got 2 laps that were fast enough for pole position. Basically came out of almost nowhere, given that Mercedes were almost not really that quick relative to the others in free practice. And then in the race, just really, really calm, controlled race, very similar to Vegas last year, where he just kind of led out front and did a very, measured race to get the win. So there you go. That is my power rankings for the 2025 Singapore Grand Prix. Thank you so much for watching, and goodbye.